All right, now let me show you how to create a middleware function from scratch. So here in the store folder, let's add a new folder called middleware. So we want to add all our middleware functions in this folder because they're central to our application. They're not specific to a particular domain, like the list of books or authentication. They're central to our application, okay? So in this folder, we're going to add a new file called logger.js. With this middleware, we're going to log every action that is dispatched, kind of like Redux DevTools. So let's write a function called logger. This function should have three parameters: store, next, and action. So action is the action that was dispatched, and next is a reference to the next middleware function. Now, if this is the only middleware function we have, next is going to be the reducer that is going to handle this action. Now, this middleware function, its signature is actually different from what you see here. It's a curried version of this function. Remember currying? So earlier in the section about functional programming, we talked about currying, which is a technique for converting a function with n parameters to a bunch of functions, each with a single parameter. We use currying in situations where we want to have a bunch of functions and each function should have a single parameter. So how can we curry this function? I told you that all we have to do is to replace these commas with arrows. So let's remove the parentheses. Store goes to next, goes to action, goes to this block of code. If this technique is unfamiliar to you, go back and watch the lesson about currying. It's a very simple concept. So in this logger, let's do a simple log. Let's display the store, then next, and finally the action. Now, let's export this function. Export default logger. So this is the simplest middleware implementation. Now to use this, we have to register it as part of setting up our store. So earlier, we add this file, configure store. In this module, we are using the configure store function of Redux Toolkit. This function takes a configuration parameter. So in this object, we're specifying our reducer. We can also specify our middleware functions. So we add another property called middleware, and we set this to an array of middleware functions. So on the top, let's import our first middleware. Import logger from middleware/logger. Then we add this function in this array. Okay, save the changes. Now back in the browser, we have a ton of messages because we have dispatched so many actions. So let's go to index.js. I'm going to comment out all these dispatch statements. We want to dispatch a single action, user added. Now save the changes. Take a look. So here's the store parameter. Now this object looks like the store object in Redux, but it's not the store. Because here we have two methods, getState and dispatch. But if you remember, the store object has a few extra methods. A lot of people think this is the store. It's not. It's an object that looks like the store. But for simplicity, we can refer to it as the store. Now, next is a function, and that is a reference to the next function in our middleware pipeline. In this case, because we have a single middleware function, next is a reference to our reducer. And action is the action that we dispatched. So its type is users/user added. Pretty straightforward. Now let's take a look at our Redux store. So look at our array of users. We don't have any users in this array. So even though we dispatched an action for adding a user, that user did not end up in this array. Here's the reason. In this middleware function, we did not call the next middleware function, which is in this case, our reducer. So if we don't call next, this action is not going to be processed further. So let's call next and pass this action. Now, back in the browser, look, we have a user object in the users array. So a middleware function is a curried version of a function with three parameters: store, next, and action. The way I memorize these parameters is by their first letter. So I remember S for store, N for next, and A for action. S and A, kind of like DNA. That's how I memorize it in my head. Also, there is another way to write this function. Some people replace the store parameter with object destruction syntax. So they pick the getState and dispatch functions from that object that looks like the store. This approach is perfectly fine, but I usually prefer to use store because that's simpler. So this is how you can create a middleware function. Now, what if you're not using Redux Toolkit? So in this example, we're creating our store by calling the createStore function of Redux. So to register our Logger middleware, we have to import a function here called apply middleware. And then we call it over here and pass our middleware as an argument. We can pass one or more middleware functions. So this apply middleware is what we call a store enhancer. It's a function that allows us to enhance our store, okay? So this is how we can configure middleware without using Redux Toolkit.